Robert Samuel Johnson was born in Lawton, Oklahoma, on February 21, 1920, in a home where the open sky was part of the everyday landscape and airplanes, still rare, seemed like omens of an impossible future. The son of a railroad worker and a teacher, he grew up between the smell of diesel oil and the stories that World War I veterans told on porches at dusk. From an early age, he showed an almost obsessive curiosity about engines and model airplanes, building wooden prototypes that flew above wheat fields and returned to his hands like extensions of his own imagination. In adolescence, his passion transformed into vocation. He worked to pay for flying hours on an improvised airstrip a few kilometers from town. When the world slid into World War II, Johnson, at just 20 years old, already mastered basic navigation instruments and had the serenity necessary to face the unexpected, an attribute that would later save his life repeatedly. In 1941, he accepted the call of the Army Air Forces and was assigned to the Army Aviation Pilot Training Program. The training period, conducted in metal chairs heated by the Texas sun, mixed exhaustive theory, almost Spartan discipline, and practical sessions in Stearman PT-17 trainers that seemed like awkward dancers when guided by inexperienced hands. Johnson, however, maintained a singular balance between intuition and method. He listened to the engine as one listens to an old friend and corrected trajectory deviations with smooth, almost elegant movements. It would be this combination of technique and sensitivity that would catch the attention of Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, in 1942. Zemke was looking for pilots capable of extracting the maximum from the new Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a robust aircraft, fast in a dive, and above all resistant to damage that would make other fighters drop like stones. Johnson seemed tailored for the machine that would soon be considered the flying tank of European skies. In January 1943, the 56th Group crossed the Atlantic in ships that creaked at the slightest swell, unloading men and parts in King's Cliff, then in Horsham St. Faith, until finally settling in Halesworth, Suffolk. England at war was a mosaic of villages covered by fog, lights extinguished at nightfall, and distant sounds of sirens warning of attacks over London. It was in this scenario that Johnson carried out his first escort missions for B-17 and B-24. Bombers. The official objective was to protect the formations to industrial targets in the heart of Germany. The unofficial one was to survive the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters that emerged from the clouds like silent predators. In initial flights, Johnson was still unfamiliar with the metallic taste of adrenaline when enemy tracers crossed the fuselage. Even so, he maintained focus on keeping squadron cohesion, absorbing Zemke's guidance on energy, altitude, and fire discipline, lessons that would become law in the skies over Europe. The real baptism of fire happened on May 14, 1943, during a mission over Antwerp. While covering the withdrawal of bombers, Johnson received the first 20mm impacts on the vertical stabilizer. In seconds, the P-47 shook with the violence of twisted steel, but maintained flight. The sensation of invulnerability of the aircraft, far from inciting bravado, strengthened the conviction that the secret to survival was maintaining lucidity amid chaos. Days later, on June 26, he would experience the episode that would forever define his reputation. During an escort over Abbeville, he found himself isolated at low altitude after being hit by anti-aircraft fire. An FW-190, flying in an ideal attack position, fired bursts that transformed the cockpit into a storm of shrapnel. Hot oil covered the windshield. The surface of the left wing opened in strips of torn aluminum. The opponent, perceiving the damage, approached even closer to complete the kill. Johnson, practically blind and with the engine losing power, could only maintain a straight line. The German pilot exhausted his ammunition, passed by the Thunderbolt, and raised his hand in salute before disappearing. Immediately thereafter, Johnson regained minimum altitude and flew the aircraft, wounded by more than 200 impacts, to a nearby base, landing without landing gear. He was received as a walking miracle and earned the unofficial nickname Immortal among mechanics, who, impressed, counted the perforations without finding critical structural damage. From that day on, Johnson's relationship with the P-47 transcended the technical field. It was as if the metal shell and the radial heart of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 shared the same desire to return home, even when everything indicated otherwise. In subsequent missions, the pilot developed a patient approach strategy, avoiding unnecessary acrobatic maneuvers and favoring high-speed dives, where the Thunderbolt surpassed any enemy fighter. The result came in successive victories between October 1943 and March 1944, a period in which he became the second highest scoring ace of the United States in the European theater, reaching 27 downed aircraft. Each success was recorded with a small white mark on the fuselage, but Johnson insisted on reminding rookies that the count in itself meant nothing if not accompanied by responsibility. It is the protection mission that defines the usefulness of the pilot, not the number of enemy planes shot down. This principle, he repeated, prevented the desire for individual glory from compromising the safety of the bombers, and consequently, the crews who depended on escort fighters. While the sky over Normandy, in June 1944, filled with parachutes and smoke from the beaches, Johnson led formations that swept railway lines, fuel depots, and mechanized columns, always careful to minimize collateral damage to civilians. In later interviews, he reported the ethical conflict inherent in fighter-bomber operations. Being in a position to fire does not necessarily mean that you should do so. Each press of the trigger carries a weight that persists beyond the initial click. The thoughtful tone contrasted with the romantic image that part of the press painted of aces. For Johnson, true heroism was keeping the senses sharp without allowing adrenaline to become a purpose in itself. This self-control was fundamental when, on September 10, 1944, he faced a formation of Bf-109s over the Belgian-German border. Even at a numerical disadvantage, he conducted the combat defensively, using sun and clouds as allies, maintaining distance until the opportunity arose to dive and disperse the group, all without risking fuel beyond the limit for safe return. With more than 100 combats to his name, Johnson was withdrawn from service in January 1945, following the Air Force policy of preserving experienced pilots for instructional functions. He left Europe with the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and other decorations, but insisted that the medals were indices of circumstances, not moral superiority. On returning to the United States, he faced an improvised transport system on routes that crossed the frozen Atlantic and North African deserts. Ironically, he commented that he had never felt as vulnerable as in the passenger cabin of a completely unarmed C-54. On American soil, he reunited with his family in Oklahoma, and after a brief rest period, accepted the invitation to train prospective fighter pilots at bases in the Southeast. There, he divided his time between technical lectures, where he detailed operational limits of the Thunderbolt and the newly introduced fleet of P-51 Mustangs, and informal conversations about emotional balance, demonstrating that mastering flight manuals was only part of the equation necessary for survival. In 1946, during an airshow event in Long Island, he met writer Martin Kadin, with whom he would collaborate in writing Thunderbolt, a book that intertwines personal memories and the trajectory of the 56th Group. The work, published in 1958, avoided a sensationalist tone, focusing on discipline, camaraderie, and leadership lessons. It became recommended reading in flight academies, not because it described spectacular feats, but because it exposed the logic behind crucial decisions made in fractions of a second. At the same time, Johnson joined the Collins Radio Company, where he participated in the development of aeronautical communication equipment, contributing to making civil aviation safer. The change from cockpit to laboratory did not eliminate the enchantment with the sound of engines. Occasionally, he accepted invitations to pilot demonstration aircraft, always reinforcing that flying, outside the context of war, was an opportunity to celebrate the peace that had been denied to him. In his youth, family life, until then postponed by global deployments, gained stability when he married Barbara Morgan in 1949. The couple established residence in Tulsa, near rivers and wide skies, that reminded Johnson of his childhood. Although he rarely commented on details of confrontations, he maintained the habit of visiting local schools, encouraging students to pursue careers in science and engineering. In these visits, he answered questions frankly, demystifying the idea of invulnerability, of aces, and emphasizing that each mission was a silent pact with chance. When asked about the sensation of shooting down a plane, he focused on explaining concepts of kinetic energy and human limitations of peripheral vision, steering away from personalizing the enemy to keep the narrative on a technical and primarily human plane. It was this approach that earned him respect not only from Allied veterans, but also from former German adversaries who decades later met him at reconciliation gatherings promoted by pilot associations. In the 1960s, when the Cold War reignited debates about air power, Johnson was invited to share his opinions in United States congressional committees. His position was consistent. Investing in pilot training and aircraft maintenance was just as important as developing new supersonic models. Reports signed by him emphasized that technology without human preparation was equivalent to having wings of wax under the summer sun. This humble view influenced crew recycling policies that reduced accident rates at American and Allied bases. Simultaneously, he became involved in support programs for veterans fighting against post-combat trauma, reminding that invisible wounds required the same attention given to the perforated fuselages he had once examined. For many young men returning from the skies of Southeast Asia, Johnson was living proof that war did not need to define the entirety of their identities. As he aged, he exchanged speed for small joys, fishing on the shores of Grand Lake or the Cherokees, restoring classic cars in the garage, long walks with his grandson Jason, to whom he explained the principle of lift, using leaves that fell from trees and described smooth curves before touching the ground. Even away from headlines, he continued receiving letters from aviation enthusiasts seeking autographs or advice for study projects. He responded to everyone with patience, noting dates, names, and even bibliography suggestions. In 1978, a team from the National Air and Space Museum interviewed him for the oral program Voices of the Air, recording 7 hours that today comprise an archive of inestimable educational value, free of war rhetoric and marked by reflections on collective responsibility in times of crisis. Robert S. Johnson passed away on December 27, 1998, at 78 years of age, after complications from kidney cancer. Veterans of various nationalities attended the funeral held in Tulsa. The coffin was covered with a flag folded in a perfect triangle, but honoring a request made during his lifetime, there were no rifle salutes or martial tones. Instead, friends and family listened to a recording of the R-2800 engine gently accelerating, a reminder that the sound, which once announced danger, now symbolized perseverance and human ingenuity. On his tombstone, they engraved the inscription he had chosen. Himself flew with courage, lived with conscience. Today, the story of the immortal of the Thunderbolt remains relevant not for the number of victories, but for the balance between technical firmness and respect for life. A legacy that goes beyond runways and crosses generations, reminding us that the true merit of flying lies in returning, landing, and above all, building a world where wings can be used to teach, connect, and protect. The years following Johnson's farewell were generous with the memory of his work. In 2002, the Lawton Airfield gained a small memorial that includes a replica of his P-47D Lucky suspended over a water mirror, not as a combat trophy, but as an engineering piece that crossed time to teach physics, mathematics, and history. To new visitors, public schools in the state adopted the space as an alternative classroom, and there, former mechanics from the 1940s and 1950s take turns explaining in simple words why radial valves still fascinate students in the age of drones. The legacy also extended to the digital world. On the centenary of his birth in 2020, a group of programmers released a flight module for home simulators that reproduces the Thunderbolt cockpit with the accuracy of each gauge. The initiative, maintained as an open-source project, bears the name Immortal, alluding to the nickname Johnson never asked for, but accepted with the discretion of someone who knows that titles matter less than behind-the-scenes work. Among aviation forums, it became common to see young Brazilians, Germans, and Japanese flying together on cooperative servers, repeating escort routes without firing a single shot, the declared objective of the educational package. In 2023, the Guy Foundation, created by his family, promoted the first Air Consciousness meeting, an annual congress aimed at discussing the mental health of civilian and military pilots. The event brought together commercial pilots who cross oceans in wide bodies and flying club operators who fly single-engine aircraft over plantations, all united by the same question: how to balance the passion for flying with the duty to preserve lives. Panels addressed fatigue, transparent debriefing, and communication free from toxic hierarchies, recommendations that Johnson had advocated since 1944, when he said that the arrogance of one can cost the landing of all. In the Smithsonian archives, the interview, recorded in 1978, underwent high-fidelity audio restoration. Edited excerpts, authorized for release by the family, already total millions of views on streaming platforms, proof that neither high-resolution nor instant entertainment replace the fascination of hearing firsthand how discipline can transform fear into lucid decision. There is, at a certain point, a phrase that encapsulates his entire journey. When I look back, I realize that each mission was, in fact, a silent promise that I would return to explain why war should not be the easiest solution. It is this message that echoes, without stridency, in contemporary debates about autonomous technology and ethical limits of air power. Thus, the story closes not with the roar of engines, but with the normality that Johnson so valued. Children running between aircraft replicas, teachers converting curiosity into practical learning, veterans sitting in folding chairs exchanging memories without dangerous nostalgia. In the end, the immortal of the Thunderbolt remains alive not in the numbers. 27 victories, more than 100 combats, hundreds of perforations in the fuselage, but in the idea that knowledge applied with responsibility can save more lives than any duralumin in armor. Perhaps this is the true safe landing of his trajectory, to demonstrate that courage is not in risking for glory, but in mastering one's own energy to, finally, let the wings rest on solid ground and share, with serenity, everything learned up there.